This podcast is brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who make and drink great spirits. Join our free email newsletter for technical and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Learn more at spiritsanddistilling.com.
Hey guys, welcome back to the latest episode of Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast. I'm your host, Sydney Jones, and today I am sitting here with Nicole Austin. She is the director of George Dickel and luxury American whiskey for Diageo, and she is an absolute complete legend. We are going to talk a little bit about her distilling background today at Kings County in New York, at Tullamore Dew, at George Dickel, and all of the really fun and cool collaborations that have come out of that and all of the different things that she has learned over her career going from a craft producer to a large format producer. Very similar to what I have done going from Few to Heaven Hill recently. So I'm very excited to have her on to talk to her today. Before we get into that conversation though, G&D Chillers understands that each distillery's chilling requirements are unique. On every distillery project, G&D offers the front-end design and engineering your team needs at no cost to you. Jim Coor, VP of Manufacturing at Red Boot Beverages, says G&D has been with us since the early days. Their knowledgeable engineers and service techs are there when we need them. We're in the midst of a large expansion, and they have been right there with us to select chiller solutions for today and the future. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com. For more than 11 years, ABS Commercial has been your full-service equipment manufacturer, designing quality distillation equipment ranging from 50 liter to 5,000 liter. Whether you're establishing a new distillery or expanding into a brew distillery, their team of experienced engineers and designers work with you to develop customized distilling solutions. With their consultative approach, they tailor to your production capacity, space constraints, and budgetary considerations to help you create quality crafted spirits. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized distilling needs. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, Sydney. It's so good to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here. For you guys who are just listening, and everyone is just listening, we're sitting at Nicole's house, and she has a very cute dog and a very cute cat, and the vibes are great. We were talking a little bit about how distillers, when you're not making whiskey, you like to drink something that's not whiskey. And her choice is very similar to mine. I love bubbles.
Yeah, there's nothing like a great bubbly wine on a Sunday afternoon.
And I think it's the polar opposite of what we make, right?
I found that a common note amongst distillers. It's either bubbly wine or like a very generic beer.
Yeah, like really cheap beer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Things that would make my ancestors cry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Drink of choice.
Yeah. I want something cold and I want something carbonated.
Yeah.
And I want something I know nothing about.
Refreshing.
Yeah. This is what I call my trash alcohol. And I have a theory that
Yeah, that's what she said when I poured her a glass. Thanks for this trash alcohol.
No. Okay. Backtrack. Everyone has a trash alcohol. It does not mean the alcohol itself is trash. It's the attitude.
It's like, this is method champagne.
No. Ma'am. The attitude toward it is trashy. Also doesn't sound great saying it out loud, but
we only drink responsibly in this household.
It's very true, but it's what you drink when you don't want to think about what you're drinking.
Exactly.
And
sometimes it's meant to be just a joy.
Exactly.
And if you're a distiller, you can't possibly drink a whiskey without thinking about it.
Way too much about it.
Way too much.
Exactly. So bubbly wine is mine. Second to cheap, generic, probably light beer, like low calorie light beer.
Love a good Jenny Light.
Yeah, exactly. The Athletic Brewing, their light beer.
Oh,
delightful.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of the non-alc beer proposition as well. Big fan.
Yeah. This is not an advertisement for Athletic Brewing. I don't even know if I can talk about Athletic Brewing on this podcast, but we're doing it anyways.
You know what does slam? Guinness 0.0.
Ooh,
actually.
Yeah.
It's
hop water has also been my.
I don't understand that.
You don't understand? No, it's like a LaCroix. It's like static, but it kind of tastes like beer. It's like if you have bunny ears on your TV and you're trying to get the picture of beer, that's what it is. It's like fuzzy beer.
In a world with beer, though,
That's true. That's very fair. Oh, but getting into the meat and potatoes.
Let's think deeply about whiskey now.
Yeah, exactly. Now that we have had a glass of champagne, let's talk about whiskey. So, Nicole, tell us a little bit about kind of all the different paths your career has taken you, because you started here in the US and then you went overseas and now you're back and you're the whiskey globetrotter.
Yeah, it's been a journey. It's not anything that I would have imagined, and I certainly wasn't planning it exactly. So before, I was in wastewater treatment before. I worked for an engineering consulting company, like a big multinational, being an environmental engineer, which I thought would be so deeply fulfilling. I was like really excited to change the world. And then I found myself, being lowered into a New York City sewer in a Tyvek suit. I was like, huh.
I've made choices.
Yeah. Like I'm still paying off my student loans and like, here I am, in the sewers.
Reenacting a scene from Ghostbusters.
Yeah. Fun facts though, every time there's like a Law and Order episode on where they find a body in like the sewer, I'm like, oh, I've been there, like it's, I know right where that is.
Love that for you.
Yeah. My tours are great. I have a favorite wastewater treatment plant in New York City, Newtown Creek, if anyone's interested. But I knew that was not, what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I had a real like aha moment, which sounds so dumb to say now, but it was not, that long ago that I didn't have the slightest clue how whiskey was made. And I was in a bar, and the very excited bartender was explaining to me how this particular whiskey was distilled. And I was just like, holy shit. Like I literally went to school to learn how to distill things. I learned it in the context of jet fuel.
This is why I think bartenders are so underrated. They really can change your life.
Oh, 100%. And it's so trite, but I love to do bartender trainings. Like you never know who's going to be in front of you. And that was just such an immediate moment for me of just like hunger for knowledge about that and excitement to get into that industry. And so many perky emails were sent out on the back of that. Like, I will be such a good asset to your distillery. It turned out, in 2007, like there were like the big guys and a couple of teeny tiny guys. And so it took me a while to actually get into the industry. But the opening was Kings County Distillery. They were the first distillery to open in New York City post-Prohibition. That was in April of 2010. They sold their first bottles in May. So the first day they ever legally sold whiskey, I showed up and just all perky, like, hello. I will work for you now.
Nothing bad's happened to you. You're just fresh and bright and clean.
I'm an engineer. That's whiskey is engineering and science, and I will out-science everybody to make the most perfectest whiskey that has ever been made, and I will be a great asset for your distillery. And they're like, we don't have any money, and like we can't pay you. And it's like, that seems fine. That seems totally fine.
Who needs money in New York City?
In New York City to live. So obviously I kept my day job, but was doing that on nights and weekends. So I became their master blender in the summer of 2010, which is a hilarious title because we had like not even filled a barrel at that time.
Well, and going into that, you see a lot of people that have master blender as their title. This is something that I joke around with my friends who are master blenders who really have cut their teeth in the industry for like a hot minute and have an illustrious portfolio of their work behind them. What is kind of your blending philosophy and approach? Because everyone does it different. I've talked a little bit about it on this podcast. And I think that a master blender, each expression that they make is as unique as their fingerprint, which I think is gorgeous. It really, you leave behind a legacy. But what is kind of your approach to blending?
It depends on what I'm making, right? I think there's no one size fits all technique. And I think that some of those more rigorous approaches can actually lead you really astray. Is it has to be fit for purpose, right? And what you need, what is important in $35 bottle of bourbon that is meant to be, consistent and the same for now and for the next forever is a really different set of requirements than like I'm blending a one-off 18-year-old. They just require really different approaches. So I think flexibility, I'm very grateful to actually have cut my teeth in Kings County, because I think some of the big guys, their blending approaches, and if you look at like what was being done kind of before, are tailored around and assume a certain scale with them. And they, because of that, assume a certain amount of like homogeneity amongst the barrels, which is an appropriate assumption to make if you're dumping hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them at a time. But when you scale down a bit, that's where I think you really get into a challenge as a blender, because suddenly the individual barrel variance becomes more impactful.
Exactly. We talk about things that we think will just blend out, but you can't do that with 5, 10, 15 barrel batches. Each barrel is very loud in that blend.
So at Kings County, I know it's every single barrel. Like every single barrel of every single blend would get nosed multiple times. The blend would get nosed. Like the barrels got sampled often because we used small barrels. We started with 5-gallon barrels. So you best be sampling those every week because they get wild.
They're volatile as hell.
Yes, they are. But I was very excited about that challenge because that was the time when there was that New York Times headline that I'm summarizing here, but Nicole Austin, everything you're doing is terrible and bullshit, and you will never have success, and your whiskey will always be awful. And it's like, thank you, New York Times, for that insight. Small barrel aging is awful, and it will never be valid. But
please tell me you have that framed.
Oh, I sure do.
Somewhere.
Yeah, I sure do. I sure do. And but it was very motivating. It was like, I'll show you. Like, just because you can't do it doesn't mean that no one can. And just with the right attention to detail. And it was actually that very next year, our rye was double gold at San Francisco, which was meaningful in that context to me because that's, with the big guys. And I have it on good authority. We almost won best in class.
Well, that's the thing about small barrels. And I've also said this quite a bit in my career because I've made a lot of whiskey that has gone into smaller casks. You just have to have a very purposeful way of distilling it in order to fit that cask. You can't distill a whiskey that would age better in a 53-gallon barrel in a way that you would fill into a small... It's just, they're two different products.
Yeah, they're not going to be... You can get the character pretty close, right? I mean, like we used that rye whiskey, I used, one of the barrels was like a 4-liter barrel just to be really, extra and prove my point. But I think a lot of it is down to just that attention to detail in sampling and in blending. Having had that background, like that was where I started from, is the idea that every single barrel matters and that they change all the time and that you can't trust them. You can't trust them. And it was a healthy ethos to bring in to, scaling up, because I think that was one of the things that Dickel struggled from was, assumptions that were built for bigger brands and approaches that were built for bigger brands that didn't work that well. And these mid-sized brands are in this funny middle place where it's too big to nose every single barrel, but it's too small that the variances don't matter, And so it took quite a different approach. And now I do a lot of assumptions, but then validating. So, like composite samples on lots and doing the blends and assuming that the lot is going to be consistent, but then also regularly sampling through dumping and like validating that it's actually turning out the way that you expected it to. And if it's not, having an early intervention in the dump.
Yeah, for sure. Now, going a little bit from there, from Kings County, you went to Tullamore, and that is a very different style of making whiskey. Yeah. And we talked a little bit about the differences between, tasting for a craft blend versus tasting for a large scale blend. What is it like tasting for a large scale foreign blend, like an international conglomerate? Tullamore makes a very different whiskey than what we make here.
They do. My role was very different at Tullamore, so I had kind of a stop in between. I worked for many years while I was at Kings County, also for Dave Pickerel. So I was his first hire, I think, in his consulting company. So I helped. That I think also really solidified my approach because I got to help a lot of different whiskey. I got to know Kings County's whiskeys probably better than everyone. I was certainly an expert in those specific whiskeys, but I wouldn't have called myself an expert in whiskey more broadly at that time. But seeing a lot of craft brands, seeing how much conscientious blending can take something from good to great. All else held the same, everything about the grain and the mashing and how they distilled it and all those things. I couldn't believe how many people were just like pulling their oldest barrels and dumping them because assuming that those would be the best ones. Adding that intentional blending was just such a big unlock for so many people. So then I went to Tullamore, and that was in 2016. And my role there was very different. I was a commissioning engineer. So it's a bigger company. You're very siloed, right? It's like my only interaction really with the blending team for William Grant was one time their master blender tried to figure out in a meeting with me a polite way to ask, like, so how do you make bourbon good?
Everyone can pause this to have a good laugh before you replay the podcast.
They just have a different idea, of what whiskey should be. And so that was very funny to me. But, my role there was very much harkening back to my early engineering days. So we did a lot of distillate sampling and quality control. And that was heavily reliant on kind of using not just one person, but large groups to do like match to standard type testing. And also at the grain whiskey distillery, hourly GC analysis, because the specs for grain whiskey are very, very tight. And there's things that you can change. Like there's things that you can intervene in a grain whiskey production, like which trays you're pulling off of. Whereas, there's no point in doing hourly sampling in like a pot and malt, because what are you going to do? You have two variables, your cut points. So it was a really interesting approach with a lot more rigor and a huge focus on efficiency. And one of the things I really took from, European production is, number one, they have a much better understanding than we do of individual congeners and their origins. Their data sharing as an industry around that, the level of coordination and collaboration they have with, universities to do that kind of analysis is just like head and shoulders above ours.
Well, it sounds like they're doing a lot of GC testing and
not just GC, like a lot of actually kind of through the process testing to, it's one thing to identify something. It's quite another to know exactly which parameters in your process drove the creation of that. And they're just way farther ahead of us. And to be fair, it's a bit simpler often. There's not so many variables when there's only one grain, but they're just light years ahead of us, as well as when it comes to efficiency measurements, much more precise. I mean, again, because the lab methods are there and they're a little more straightforward with, malt barley as your base, but their focus on efficiency and their use of technology to be really energy efficient in their distilleries was things that really struck me as ahead of American whiskey.
Before we go further into that, for those who are not as familiar with what GC is, could you give a brief rundown as to GC testing and what you were looking for exactly?
Yeah, GC mass spec is what it's called. So it's gas chromatography, mass spectroscopy. It's basically like shaking molecules and like kind of exciting them. And then it's a way of measuring essentially like how heavy they are. So the readout, it sounds very technologically advanced. And so people, I think, often give too much weight to these kinds of readouts. It's basically telling you the molecular weight. Like that's what it's giving you. And you can do some inferences from what we know about like standards in whiskey to know exactly what that compound is. But the GC can't tell you how those carbons exactly are bonded together. And it's mostly useful for comparing and contrasting two things. Like a GC can't tell you if something is good or not good, but it can tell you, did a compound suddenly show up that wasn't there before? Or is a compound that's been consistently there, every day for the last 6 months, is it suddenly gone? Those are the kinds of things it can tell you.
Yeah. And we were talking a little bit before this about, AI and its implications for our industry and people who...
Good luck.
People who are starting to try to incorporate it into distilleries and the implications for that. But, we were talking a little bit about like the AI has to understand how to analyze what it's analyzing. Like you have to give it.
Tech is only as good as the data you feed it and train it with. We just do not have great data.
Yeah.
In our industry.
And that's the nice thing about instruments like GC. Like it'll give you information. I couldn't feed GC information into AI and AI could tell me if it was a good whiskey or not.
Absolutely not.
Exactly. So it's going to be really interesting to see how AI shapes things because it's getting more and more chatter. Have you encountered any of it at Dickel?
I mean, we're all using AI right now in our distilleries. Like that's, fuzzy logic on PLCs and things like the control systems. And I only know this because this is what my husband does. This is not something that most distillers would know. Or most anybody would know. You should have him on to explain this. But it's, the way your logic controller right now knows to seek a temperature and how to like adjust a valve to seek a temperature. Like that is AI. We're using it now, so it's not such a foreign thing, but I'm not sure it's made anyone dramatically better. Maybe more efficient. Those kinds of controls can make you much more efficient with energy usage, with water usage, but more consistent, certainly, but they're not going to tell you how to be great.
Yeah. Well, and that was going to be my next question for you, is about, energy efficiency.
Yes.
And just general distilling efficiency. As someone who has an environmental science background, I'd love to get your thoughts on it. But before we go into that, if you're planning a distillery or brewery launch, adding a distillery to your brewery, or considering purchasing an existing brewing or distilling business, then visit breweryworkshop.com for more information about the Brewery and Distillery Workshop, brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling and Craft Beer and Brewing. Over 4 days, you'll learn what it takes to get a successful craft beverage business off the ground through panel discussions, working group sessions, technical tours, and more. Get your ticket now at breweryworkshop.com. So the distillery that I'm currently working at in Bardstown that's being built out has some really, really exciting sustainability measures being put into it. Wastewater recycling and treatment. We're trying to utilize a lot of energy efficient appliances and technology and equipment. So you talked a little bit about, Tullamore efficiency and being also energy efficient and sustainable. How do you kind of counterbalance those, especially working for a company as large as Dickel? Because you guys make so much. You make so much.
It's funny how your perspective can shift so quick.
I know.
Have Todd tell you the story of what I said the first time I walked into his rick house.
Oh, he's told me that story. Yeah. Do you want to retell it right now since we're referencing it? Yeah.
So I walked into Todd's rick house for the first time after we start collaborating together. And it just, how sometimes things just fall out of your mouth.
Yeah.
They just come from your brain to your mouth. And I go, is this it?
Todd being Todd Leopold of Leopold Brothers out in Colorado, which we'll talk about.
Me walking into the rick house that he spent the last decade lovingly and painstakingly filling with some of the most beautiful distillates in the entire United States, on a skeleton crew, as an independent small business. And the first thing that came out of my mouth was, is this it? But in my defense, he then came to my distillery and walked into one of my rick houses and was like, oh. And I was just thinking about, how much I believe in our collaboration and the huge potential I see for it, and comparing that to the number of physical barrels I was standing in front of at that moment is what I had in mind. But I'm very embarrassed about it. But
we'll talk more about that later on in the podcast. But yeah. Sustainability and efficiency.
Something I love about working for a bigger company, when I started in craft, I really identified with that ethos, right? This idea that I thought that the smaller distilleries were the most closely aligned with my values, around the environment and the land and community and ethics and safety. And, obviously, the thing about craft is it's so person-to-person dependent, right? Because it's so driven by just a few personalities and a few people and kind of the whims of investors, and there's no HR. And, it doesn't align as closely, I guess I'll say, with my values about what it means to be like a responsible and good creator as I had thought. And it can. It's not to say that it cannot, but I just, being young, I was like, the world is black and white and small is good and big is bad and damn the man, And now, I see, first of all, there's just an economy of scale that just makes production more efficient. Just full stop, all else held the same. That's just always going to hold true. But then when it comes to things like, responsible energy use, you spend a lot of energy like starting up and shutting down. So, 24-hour operations are just on their own going to be massively more efficient. And then there's a lot of scales where some of the energy reuse technologies, don't make sense and don't really exist at a scale that would be useful or beneficial or kind of a net good for a smaller distillery. Because of course you have to count, you're thinking holistically about sustainability, the energy that went into making the thing that you're using is sort of a negative, like a deficit that you have to make up before it starts becoming like a net good, right? And you just have to make more for a lot of that math to tip over. So there's that kind of economy of scale that comes from it. And then there's just you can be so much more impactful, at scale, like making choices around switching boilers off of fuel oil, or going to electric, or, especially I'm really excited to see a little bit more of that like MVR, TVR type technology coming over here. There's just some things that you can do that can really start to make big step changes, around your production. Also, a lot of craft distilleries tend to be located like, in more urban centers, which makes complete sense. Like you have to, be close to the people that you're selling to, but certainly the stuff that feeds our distillery and like trucking it long distances in compared with trucking the relatively small, lighter volume of stuff you produce out, there's just some real realities, around that when I really got in and started working with it, it surprised me, how much more closely in a lot of ways this aligned with my values about what it means to make good whiskey. The attention to sustainability, the emphasis on it, the willingness to do real analytics. Like we get third-party verification of all of our claims, like that are independent and happen consistently over time. We have public, Diageo Society 2030 goals that we publicly announce, how close we've come to achieving those. It's just a standard of, it's a rigor that not a lot of other folks apply. So I'm proud to be a part of that. And the thing that's the most frustrating about it though, as much as I'm glad that we're all talking about this and we do all need to pay attention to it, when you look at the kind of life cycle analysis of a bottle of whiskey, the vast majority of our carbon footprint is in the packaging. So we can do all of the work all day, to really take our contribution as producers down. But at the end of the day, it's policy level solutions around glass recycling is what we really need.
For sure.
As an industry.
Yeah.
It's not sexy, but that's what we need.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that's been really interesting to me in terms of how I think about sustainability on a large scale is not just how to be a good citizen for the planet and, recycle and reuse and reduce all of these things that were preached, but sustainability in terms of your workforce and your people.
Yeah.
This is the first time I think I've started to really kind of grasp, it's not the first time, but I've been moving towards this more and seeing people in my industry, coworkers, colleagues, things like that, who are so invested in what they're doing that they give everything that they have, but they don't leave anything for themselves. And now that I'm working for a larger producer, I'm seeing that like they do really kind of push you, like have a work-life balance, like you have a set shift here and that's it. And I think it's a good thing. For me, it's been a really interesting shift where, I would go from working all these additional hours just because I loved it so much. And I was never forced to do that. I'm not talking bad about anyone I worked with. I love where I've come from and I love the distilleries that I've worked for, but it's just an interesting shift now working with people who, they see their shift and they respect their shift, and they're very cognizant of what they can give, and, creating a healthier, more sustainable mindset for themselves. And I think ultimately that creates a healthier, more sustainable whiskey as well.
I mean, it means so many things. It's such a squishy word, which is part of the both beauty and challenge of it. Something that I've been really holding a lot of, and that I'm excited about, in more recent, broad conversations about responsibility and sustainability, is around a lot of what we were taught, in our youth, around individual responsibility and, your personal choices around straws and glass, that's the best you can do. But a lot of that was these companies and these producers, pushing the responsibility off of themselves and onto us as individuals to be responsible, for the planet. And that's never going to move the needle, right? The idea that you as one person, I think we should all do the best that we can, but policy solutions are what's needed. Broad impacts are made at the policy level with large companies who are doing the most of the emitting. And I really like working for a company that recognizes that, speaks about it, and speaks about their own responsibility, as a corporation, as being much bigger than any one individual's responsibility. And that, that really resonates with me. I think we all kind of got sucked into that and just allowed a lot of the responsibility to be pushed onto us when it never really belonged there.
For sure.
In the first place.
Yeah, there's no reason I should think I have to unplug every single charger and lamp in my house when I'm not using it, because it's going to suck up electricity and the planet's going to catch on fire.
When it could be much easier to, pass legislation saying limiting passive consumption of electricity in consumer goods, right? Because we can't rely on everyone being like you and being a psycho unplugging your appliances.
I am a psycho. I'm not that much of a psycho, but I remember after watching it was the sustainability concert for global warming.
Yeah.
I remember the Jonas Brothers performed at it, and I'm like, the Jonas Brothers are telling me I have to unplug my phone charger, so I'm going to unplug my phone charger.
Little did they know they were a tool of capitalism.
Well, they have a private jet, so that's a whole
I guess they did know.
Mm-hmm.
I guess they may have known.
So going from Tullamore, and we talked a little bit about your work at Dickel and how, sustainability and that being a core ethos tenet that you guys have. So tell us a little bit about your work at Dickel, what you do. What does a director of George Dickel do?
So when I came to Dickel, I was in Ireland when I was approached about the role. And, the two things I love most in the world are whiskey and horses. So
same.
Ireland was I was like, this is my jam. This is the magical land of fairies and whiskeys and horses. And why would I ever leave?
Not just any horses, but sport horses.
Yeah, the best horse. That's where I got Violet, and she, amazing. She helped me fly. But I was there, and this opportunity about Dickel, it was so alluring. It's one of those few. There's not that many American distilleries that are still around today that can really draw a direct line, clearly to the origins and heritage of American whiskey, right? And the kind of birth of American whiskey as a style. There's not a lot of things creations that we have kind of as Americans that are uniquely ours. We're kind of a melting pot and mishmash of, other cultures' things, but American whiskey is something we really created. And so that is just intriguing on its face, right? And the other distilleries that have that kind of connection, most of them already have a pretty well-formed modern identity. And Dickel was sort of this little unknown that had kind of floated along, after Merle Haggard was our spokesperson in the 70s. That was the heyday of Dickel. I still haven't beat out the sales from that era.
Do you have any vintage advertising?
Absolutely.
I was about to say, God.
Yeah. Water's for washing and Dickel's for drinking, says Merle Haggard.
I want that as a tattoo.
Yeah, there's some fantastic. And so I've still not outsold Merle. It's a deep ambition of mine. But after that, Appletinis happened, and Dickel was it didn't get taken along in the bourbon boom. So it was just such a unicorn, right? It's this heritage distillery full of knowledge and skill and like quality whiskey, but that no one seemed to know about. And I, in my naivety, got there and thought, I'm just going to tell people, I'll just go around and tell people what beautiful whiskey we have. And I'll get into the distillery and like, you know, use my engineering skills to make our whiskey like even more awesome. And I was super excited to be doing that. And I got there and I realized that, number one, the folks who've been running the distillery did not need me to tell them how to make great whiskey at all. Like, we've done some new stuff, which was very impactful in, and we've started to, you know, I've driven some quality programs. Like, I've done some things, but, you know, they've been running that distillery quite successfully since before I was in the industry. But what we did need was, no one understood what Tennessee whiskey was. And those that did thought they were kind of too good for it, you know? And I was going around like trying to explain to everyone like, oh, you know, Tennessee whiskey is a type of bourbon. But I found, you know, by the time you're referencing the Code of Federal Regulations in a conversation, you've lost like most people. So that wasn't really gonna work. And so I just really had to kind of sit back and think about like, how am I going to show this whiskey to its best advantage? And we had a funny, you know, the distillery has been like turned on and turned off and turned up and turned down. And we just had a really funny, like, mishmash of barrels. We had a lot of them, but weird ages, a lot of different flavor profiles, not a really great way of like kind of knowing what was what. And that ended up being really where the blending came in. And that is really the part of whiskey making that I'm ultimately the most passionate about. And so I really kind of took a whole look at what were all the whiskeys we had and what were they like. My maturation team thought I was nuts. You know, I'm like, no, we're going to go and take composite samples from every single aging lot of whiskey we have over 4 years old. And they're like, no, but do you know how many there are? And it's like, yeah. Like, that's going to take months. I'm like, sorry. Like, damn Yankee, you know, running this distillery. But it was the only way. So I just really sat down and asked a brand new question of like, what do we really have? What is our house style? And what's the best way? Like, what are the best bottles and the best uses of these whiskeys?
I love that you bring up house style, because the last episode I talked with Connor O'Driscoll about, you know, how he interprets the Heaven Hill house style. You know, it's a distillery that's been around since 1935. There's a big history before you, and there will be a big history after you. So how do you not only interpret it, but how do you honor it? And I'm going to ask this, I think, just kind of going forward with whoever I interview. So the question to you now is, you know, and you're kind of answering it as you go through, but how do you honor it? How do you interpret it? How do you improve it?
Yeah. Well, if you believe Reddit threads,
No.
The internet was pretty convinced that Dickel's house style is this like kind of waxy vitamin, like Flintstone vitamin character, which is definitely present in some of our legacy SKUs. And I was kind of told, I guess, and had started to believe that maybe that was our house style. That was, you know, they could always identify whiskey from Dickel, obviously. Meanwhile, like, basically nobody can do that. But it was so distinct, and that was our house style. So I was like, you know what? Is it though? Like, is it? And so I went in and noticed all of our whiskeys. And honestly, I'm not sure that anything that I would call a house style emerged from that. Like, there was no, you know, aging barrels are so variable. And even if you are being incredibly consistent in your production methodologies, which is not easy, because as you know, like, you know, things have to be maintained, things have to be upgraded. Every time you change something a little bit, it's got to be recommissioned, you know, refigured out. Operators always tend to do things a little bit differently, even if they all have the same SOPs. You know, they all have like a slightly different approach to how they run that particular piece of equipment. There's more variability than anyone really acknowledges. And then you get into the maturation. It's like, there was not one thing that I could pick out that said like, oh, that, you know, whatever, apple, like, or even just like something as simple as like fruitiness that was obvious. So in one way, that's scary, because it's like, well, now you have to figure out the answer for yourself. But it was also kind of quite freeing. It's like, well, you know, it's an opportunity as a blender to say like, well, what do I like about what our whiskeys are? what is calling to me, so I can choose to emphasize that character. And I could have taken it in a lot of different directions. And I picked the ones that I thought that spoke to me the most as a producer, and also that I thought people would enjoy, because at the end of the day, like, water's for washing and Dickel's for drinking, right? So it's not just me that I'm serving.
Yeah. I mean, I've always said that, whiskey is agriculture. It's something I believe really, really, really personally, deeply in my soul. And agriculture isn't uniform. It's not identical. It's not consistent. Agriculture is anything other than consistent. So whiskey shouldn't be either. And I just think it's interesting that the Dickel house style is that there is no house style, but there's so much opportunity. So much opportunity.
I think people drive terroir more than anything. Like, it's people create a house style. Like what Connor thinks is good whiskey is probably more impactful at the end of the day than any decision around yeast strain.
100%.
And what you decide
exactly
will be more impactful than any decision around 14% or 17% of some grain.
Yeah. I love the people as terroir kind of idea. We discussed it a lot. Nicole and I did a panel a few years back at a conference in Portland with our good friend Todd Leopold of Leopold Brothers. We also did it with Molly, who is the co-host of this podcast.
And an amazeballs distiller.
And so she's a perfumist now. She's making perfume.
Amazing.
It's amazing. Shout out Duality Scents.
Amazing.
Yeah, they're very good. Highly, highly recommend. And then we had Robert Licorice on from Iron Root in Texas. And we were talking about, these unique distinctions between all of these different whiskeys being made across a very wide swath of this country. And ultimately, the climate will have a huge impact. The way that you're distilling is going to have a huge impact. But ultimately, the decisions of us as makers has the biggest impact. And Todd was so interesting and gave out some really good examples of the decisions that he had made as a Colorado distiller.
Mm-hmm.
And you work very closely with Todd.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about...
I love working with Todd.
I love Todd so much.
He's the nicest man in this entire industry, I'm pretty sure.
I hope he listens to this. He's my favorite.
We love you so much.
We love you so much. I should bring him on and talk to him.
You should.
I should.
You're going to have to... It's going to be like the 3-hour special, because that's how long
I'm down.
Talk. Yeah.
I'm super down. I learned something from him every single time we talk.
Single time.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been amazing. I mean, you talked earlier about sustainability, right? And all the squishy things that it means. And one of the things that I've been thinking about really in my entire career is, how is the American whiskey industry going to be sustainable? How are we going to survive? In all those times as a craft distiller, I did a lot of industry organizing work, right? Of course, with the New York State Distillers Guild and being president of that association, being on the founding board of the American Craft Spirits Association, co-chairing that legislative committee for many years. I thought a lot about what exactly did we need to survive as an industry. And I know that seems like a bit of a segue to what it's like to working with Todd, but that's what drove me to make this collaboration real and make it important, because as passionate and as excited as I was about the whiskey, and I am, and it is beautiful, and none of this would matter or be helpful at all if the whiskey wasn't amazing. But because it is, I think it's shown a path where the industry can be viable for both large and small scale distillers. And, these are lessons that we've taken looking around at other countries and how their small distillers, have survived, right? Like, Islay whiskey does not survive on the back of the world's appetite for licking a campfire. It's because of its use in blends. And, most of the Scotch whiskey is made in grain distilleries, right? Like, that's the bulk of it is there. So how do these tiny, small, crafty single malt distilleries, how have they survived? And that ecosystem is very economically healthy. And so that was really interesting to me. As a craft spirits producer, you're in a bind, right? You're kind of stuck in between this catch-22 of either making something that is really recognizable as a part of the category, so like a really recognizable bourbon or a really recognizable rye or something like that. But then because of economies of scale, you're always going to be selling that bourbon for twice the price of the one next to it that's maybe comparable-ish, which is tough. Or you have to make something that's really unique that a large producer would never make. And you have this advantage of like, you're the only one that could do that. You know, like a large producer would never take the risk, never do something like that. But then you're always going to be facing an uphill battle, trying to explain to people what it is, how to drink it, how to use it. This to me was the answer for that. It's really allows Todd to be the best producer that he can be, you know, to focus 100% of his time and energy on driving big, historic, interesting flavors, leveraging production techniques that would never be possible at scale, and driving that attention to detail to drive these really big, interesting flavors that I can then take and blend in a way that those wild flavors will lend complexity, interest, sophistication to a whiskey that will still be understandable by most of the drinking public, right? So you can sell this product to most people that would want to drink whiskey, but it's going to be better because it has all the complexity of what Todd can produce, but it's not so weird that it requires really an explanation about why it's good. And that, that's us doing what we're best at. My base is consistent. I can blend it into something that most people will understand. I can use my scale kind of delivery to the market, the marketing budget that I have, which Todd thought was just amazing, to bring what's special about him to the world and, give him cash flow, give me some really interesting and beautiful whiskeys to work with, and then ultimately make something that people will like genuinely want and love to drink and come back to again and again. And that, more than anything else, that's what was exciting to me about this project, is I hope it's a path forward that can help us all survive.
I love hearing you talk about it. We've talked about it before and how it kind of was born, but every single time that you talk about it, I feel like a tingly in my jellies. It makes me really excited because it's a gorgeous whiskey. It is so variable. If you guys haven't had the chance to try the Dickel Leopold Brothers collaboration, it's a rye whiskey.
Yes, it is. It's a blend of straight rye whiskeys is the class and type.
Which is my favorite to begin with. I'm really biased, but I love rye whiskey. I think it's a more interesting whiskey. It's a more interesting grain. Bourbon pays my bills, but I love rye and I drink a lot of rye.
It's beautiful.
And it has so many different layers that it's so interesting as a sipper, but it's so accessible that it makes delightful cocktails. And it can fit into so many different
And that's ultimately what
roles.
It's for. Like
Yeah.
it's the purpose of creating this whiskey was to resurrect, what the style of American rye whiskey was at the birth of the American cocktail movement, right? So most of these cocktails are using rye, right, as a backbone for them. But when you make them with modern rye, like we're all looking at thinking, these old cocktail books, like they were like bad bartenders or something. But what we don't realize is that the rye whiskey tasted completely different then. And it's not just a matter of yeast strains or heirloom grains. Like functionally, how they distilled the whiskey was entirely different. And it's just exciting. I mean, like, I like making a precious whiskey that is beautiful and that you can sip on. And like you could, talk about the flavor components for hours on end. Or you just make a really nice Manhattan and just have a really nice evening,
Well, and in terms of like a blending philosophy, do you think when you are working on a new product, like this is going to be for cocktails or this is going to be that one that you just sip? It's for the connoisseur. It's for the whiskey snob. I've heard people do it different ways and some people start at that end point.
Yeah, it depends, which is a bit of a cop-out. But the best whiskeys, I think, you can do both. Right?
For sure.
Like the absolute best whiskeys should be able to do all of the things that a great whiskey should do. So that includes sipping neat. That includes drinking, with a beer. That includes putting a couple of rocks or some water in it and having it still be delicious. That includes making all of the classic whiskey cocktails. Like it should at least work. A truly great whiskey can tick every single one of those boxes. But not every whiskey is truly great. Not every whiskey is the pinnacle of what that, is capable of producing. That's just not how bell curves work. So sometimes when you're operating off the peak of what whiskey can be, then you have to pick, which boxes are you going to tick with this particular one? Are you going to tick a cocktail box? Are you going to tip a sipping box? Like which box are you going to tick? So if you're not making like the best whiskey in the entire category, you have to pick. I mean, not to like brag, but I think this particular whiskey actually ticks all of those boxes.
No, I would agree.
It's not often you get to do that in your life as a producer. Like it does all the things.
No, and I love that. So before I really got into being an exclusive whiskey distiller, I made a lot of gin in my career. And something I would do when I was working on a new gin, because I worked on one particular gin for like 2 years, was trying to figure out what it was going to be. What kind of cocktail is this going to go in? Because gin is a cocktail spirit. Was this going to be a martini gin? Was this going to be a Tom Collins gin? Was this going to be a G&T gin? So it's something that, from a gin perspective, I always tell makers to keep in mind. If you're making a gin, you've got to know how your consumer is going to drink it. And I think some of that can be applied as well to blending. But every once in a while, you capture lightning in that bottle. And I would say that you guys have. And it might be biased because you're a good friend of mine. But I also tried that whiskey before I met you guys. So it's incredible. I'm very proud of y'all.
When I started blending with that, like it's, when you're an American whiskey blender, it's a bit of this is kind of a silly metaphor, so you have to forgive me, but it's like, trying to create beautiful music with one instrument. And of course you can, right? Like, we're using new oak almost entirely. So, you've got vanilla and tannins like that are just always really strongly in there. And, corn, and it's simpler, right? Like there's a lot of scale of quality in there, but like you're only coloring with a certain number of colors. You're only playing with kind of one instrument. Using the 3-chamber rye, like what Todd made, was suddenly a whole new section. Suddenly you've got a horn section and like strings and you just had so much more. There's flavors and aromatics in there that I've just never seen in an American whiskey. And they just fit together in a way, like the top notes from his and the bottom. It was a thrill to blend with that stuff and to find the plate. Like that was one of the only times you get to just make whiskey for whiskey's sake. Like it's not often you get to do that, to just genuinely explore. Like, I don't know, what's the best here? Like what is the most beautiful whiskey, and 0.5% difference of that 3-chamber made a huge swing. So really messing around with like, not trying to match anything, because who are you going to match? Like no one's tasted this whiskey for 100 years. Like it was just, what is the most beautiful thing that we can make right now? And yeah, it's not often that you get to do that.
Now, I know when talking to Todd about the 3-chamber still that like a lot of American producers utilize them.
Yeah.
They were extraordinarily common before they were melted down and made into like modern column stills.
That's what was so shocking. It's one thing to find like some esoteric bit of lore and recreate something. It's quite another to learn that the standard for making a standard type of American whiskey was completely different than what we thought. In that survey that gave him the information first, that IRS survey from 1902, they surveyed something like 30 odd distillers. About half of them were making rye. I think there was like 14 rye producers in the survey. 13 of them were using a 3-chamber still.
Do you know if Dickel ever utilized a 3-chamber?
They did.
See, yeah, they
did.
Oh,
and
that's so cool.
That was so exciting to me.
That really is kind of like a serendipitous moment where like, not only like, should we be making this because it's delicious, but from a historical legacy standpoint, like it really brings everything back full circle.
It's just so cool to find out. And like, there, on no planet ever could I go to, the board at Diageo and say, I'd like to spend $2 million on a still. It's going to make 6 barrels a day. Right. Like, no, like, absolutely not. But that's why craft distillers exist, right? Like Todd can do that. And then I can pay him fairly for that and make sure that he shares in the benefit of that whiskey. And, we can both do what we're best at, so I can make the whiskey that's the base of that, bring that fruity character, bring the base and then build his top notes on top of it. And it's meant to be.
No, just the historical precedence there. I had no idea that Dickel ran a 3-chamber, but given how old they are, I suspected it.
Yeah, in the late 1800s. Yeah.
That's so cool.
But the blend is the closest approximation of what most whiskey would have tasted like. So although most of those distillers were using 3 chambers, there were also a number of scale column distillers, even going back, the coffee still is 1812, right? So even then, there were also a large number of distillers making light-bodied column distilled rye. And the majority of the rye whiskey that if you went and ordered one, at any tavern in the US at that time, it would have been a blend of column distilled rye and 3-chamber rye, which is why the collaboration existed. That's how Todd called me. It was a decade into this project by the time he learned that particular nugget of historic information and was like, oh, crap, like I can't go back in time and make column distilled rye. These are the trials and tribulations of being a whiskey distiller. It's like, oh, I can't go back 5 years and make a different choice. So I got to kind of come in at the 10-yard line with the thing that got us all the way to resurrecting the historic style.
That's so interesting. I always also like to say that whiskey, in addition to being agriculture and people being terroir, it's like a time capsule.
Oh.
You're drinking, the result of grain that took seasons to grow. You're drinking the result of trees that took 100 years to mature. And there's so much time and effort wrapped up in one little drop. And then you add on to that all of the historical precedents with like what you guys made. It's so special. So like there really aren't even words.
Well, and of course, there's the perpetual embarrassment of blending with whiskeys that you made, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and just being continuously confronted with match-writs that remind you of how little you knew a decade ago. So, win some, lose some.
It's like a diary.
Yeah.
You go back and you're like, man, that was really cringy when I wrote that. Dear diary. Today, the Jonas Brothers told me to unplug my laptop as it was charging.
Yes.
For global warming.
Yes. So rough.
Oh,
You're like,
man.
oh, I fixed that later.
We've come a long way, though, I would like to think. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for being on today. I really, really, really appreciate it.
It was such a pleasure. It's always fun talking to you.
And before we go, for more than 30 years, G&D Chillers has had the proven solution for distilleries. Visit them today at gdchillers.com. Whether you're establishing a new distillery or expanding into a brewstillery, ABS Commercial is your full-service equipment manufacturer for equipment ranging from 50-liter to 5,000-liter. Visit breweryworkshop.com to secure your ticket to this September's Brewery and Distillery Workshop. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, go to spiritsanddistilling.com and sign up for our free newsletter featuring news stories every week from some of the best writers and distillers in the distilling world. Now, Nicole, if people want to learn more about what you are doing at Dickel, where should they find that information out?
You can, do a Google. We have a pretty good website, georgedickel.com. You could also always follow me on the Insta. It's Nicole Marie Austin. It's mostly my horse and dog.
I know, and I love it.
Yeah, there's an occasional whiskey. I mean, the hardest thing about like what we're working on now is like, I can't tell you. But when it comes around, definitely you can check our website. George Dickel has an Instagram. It's at George Dickel. And keep an eye out.
It's so funny. People ask me if they can follow me on Instagram. Like, you're going to see a lot of like dog and cat pictures.
I get regular, occasional emails from our social media team. That's like, hey, could you like do some whiskey stuff? I'm like, yeah, good call. Sorry. My bad.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. And we will be back in 2 weeks with another in-depth distilling conversation for you. Thanks for joining us. And we'll see you then. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who love to make and drink great spirits. Join our free newsletter today at spiritsanddistilling.com for pragmatic, technical, and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Sign up now at spiritsanddistilling.com or click on the link in the show notes.